Of course, each one of those fellows that I had the opportunity to hear did an excellent job. Their material was so pertinent, and how to preach the gospel, and realizing that the gospel is not politically correct, and if there was a more pertinent lesson than that to teach, I don't know what it would be, obviously. And this one, of course, just anywhere that you study in the Bible is going to be applicable to us in one way or another for sure. But I thought that, and maybe it's because of my age, and maybe it's because of the difficulties that we face, and this is, generally speaking, an older class out here. And so we've been through more than, say, them young whippersnappers down there in the back, that young adult class with Charles down there, of course. Charles is one of the young men down there, and but he's not, but he's down there anyhow. But so I thought we might could be benefited greatly by a particular study in what is sometimes referred to as poetical literature. Now, there's a reason for that, of course, or wisdom literature. Those are two different concepts that are associated with 5 books right there in the middle of the Old Testament, beginning with Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. That's wisdom literature, or it's also sometimes called poetry. And of course, the poetry that I learned when I was in school, or I was supposed to learn, they was rhyming that went along with it, and violets are red, roses are red, violets are blue, those type of rhymes. But the poetry here we're talking about, it doesn't fit into that same category. Hebrew poetry has a tendency to state the same thing in a number of different ways, or make a statement and then say something that's the very opposite of that, or make a statement and then expand on it a little bit. And so when you're dealing with that type of literature, it doesn't read like history. Now, it just so happens that this particular book is full of history. And of course, we'll see that, and we'll try to develop as we go along through this study. But the one significant point throughout it all is that the overriding principle of everything that we're going to study and learn from this particular book, which we already know already, but it's going to be reinforced with this, is that even good people face bad stuff from time to time. Even good people have to deal with some not so pleasant things in life. And we're going to see that in the life of Job for sure. And obviously he's a great man. He has wonderful characteristics. We see that at the very beginning of the book. But yet he faced a whole lot of difficulties. And we could go so far as to say that in principle, the things that he faced, then we are susceptible to face too. And the way that he handled it, then we could probably not do much better than to handle it the best way that he did. And the demonstration of how he dealt with the matters is something that we can learn from as well. He wasn't a man above sin, obviously, but he was a faithful man. And he's held up, of course, as a wonderful example, not only in this particular narrative, but at other times as well, even in the New Testament, pointing back to the historical character that is recognized as being Job. One of the songs that we sometimes sing, and it used to be a song mainly associated with funerals, and that is Father Alone, tempted and tried, whereof maybe one. Well, that song sort of gets at the heart of everything that we want to learn and see here in the book of Job. Things sometimes are just not that enjoyable. Some things are just hard to put up with. But yet we cannot put ourselves in the position where we think that we are suffering more intensely than anybody ever has, or we're facing more difficulties than anybody has ever faced in their lives. Where that's just not the case. We have the tendency to elevate the problems that we face to be insurmountable, and then we look at the little bitty pebbles that other people are facing and say, I can't believe it. Look how much trouble they're having with a little insignificant thing. Well, we don't know the full story. We don't know what is going on behind the scenes. Just as we used the example on Sunday, if we knew what many people were having to deal with day after day, night after night, then when we saw them, we would probably run, hug their neck, and say, keep on hanging in there, because we're unaware. And the teachers feel that way, I guarantee you. And poor kids come to school, and if the teachers knew what they were having to deal with at home, then they'd probably be as patient as they are, maybe a little bit more patient. Why can't this young'un pay attention? And I never forget the first class that Tammy taught when we moved back down here from Smith County. And there was a little boy in the classroom, and he just had a blank stare on his face all the time. Now, he was not motivated at all to do anything, you know. Well, then finally, something happened. He had been sick, and he missed a couple of days, so she went to the address where he was living. He was living in a trailer, him and his little sister, with his mom and daddy who stayed drunk. There was no electricity, and there was no running water in that trailer. And the reason why the poor little fellow wore the same pair of breeches every day is because he didn't have anything else. Well, now that sort of changed your perspective about that poor little fella and what he's having to deal with each day. And then he comes to school, and so he's sort of mesmerized and sort of don't know what to think because and of course, he may think that everybody's got that same situation. Everybody's having to deal with this. How could people be so happy? How can people be smiling and everything going on when they're having to deal with the same thing I am? And of course, that was one of the things that I noticed when I went to Moscow. You did not see anybody in Moscow smiling. Smiling was off by you. Couldn't do that. If you were smiling, that meant you'd done something wrong. And you didn't want to be looked at as doing something wrong or have something to be happy about, because then that would put people's eyeball on you to see what is he doing here. For some reason he's happy, and there ain't no reason to be happy in this culture, so obviously he's a crook or something. You know, well, that's a sad way to live. And yet there's far too many people in the world that have to deal with those types of things, that if they do get through it, then it is truly an amazing thing because of their will and determination to deal with it. So that song, Tempted and Tried, why it should be thus all the day long, that song certainly goes to the heart of what we're going to be studying about. But we oftentimes have the tendency to think that everybody that's ever amounted to anything had a silver spoon in their mouth, you know, or they were born with added benefits, and we fail to realize sometimes the difficulties that people overcame in their life. Did you know that Julius Caesar was an epileptic? I didn't know that for a long time. Of course, we know that Franklin Roosevelt, you know, was crippled, and for a long time, you know, you didn't ever see him out from behind his desk, because he didn't want, or somebody didn't want him to look weak, and he would look weak if he was actually on his crutches instead of sitting behind a desk and looking stately and all. So there's been many people who have overcome tremendous obstacles and been able to accomplish great things, and of course, as we'll see in this particular study, that's going to be the case as well with good old Job. So if you have your material there, we're just going to look at it together as far as we can get. We're going to read some of it, and there are questions in here. This course material was originally put together by Mark Copeland, who preaches down in Florida. I've met Mark. He's got a website. He makes a lot of stuff available. He's from the non-cooperation side of some of our brethren, and they make all of their material absolutely free. They don't try to make a dime off of nobody, which is commendable for sure. So we're going to use his material and get the best that we can out of it. So we look at the introduction. Of course, you can see the layout of the whole book as to how much material we're going to be covering. And what he says on that first page, before we skip over it, this study guide was developed in preparation for teaching adult Bible classes. Well, it just so happens that's what we're in. So it works, right? The objectives for each section are usually things I plan to emphasize during the class. I found that summarizing and outlining helps me to understand better the Word of God. It's practice I highly recommend to others. And of course, just about every class that we ever studied, we do try to outline at the beginning so you can see the general flow of what you're going to be studying over that period of time. And that's what we're going to do in this study as well. So let's look at an introduction to the book. And when you talk about an introduction to the book, it's not like, I remember the first time I took a class along this line, and you were spending in-depth amount of time in studying the totality of a book and all, and said the introduction said, "Hello there, Mr. Job. This is Mr. Job." That's not the idea of introducing the book like that. It has to do with all the things we're going to bring out in this particular little introductory material here. The book of Job has long been praised as a masterpiece of literature. And here are some quotes from some highly respected authors down through the centuries. Victor Hugo said, "Tomorrow, if all literature were to be destroyed and it was left to me to retain one work only, I would save Job." Well, obviously, he had a pretty high estimation of the book of Job, didn't he? And he knew there was such a thing as the book of Job. And he had received great benefit from the book of Job. And he saw that he could see benefit to be derived from the future, and not only for him, but other people, if they had access to such a writing as the book of Job. And of course, the reason why that's the case is because it's an inspired record from God to help us understand better. Tennyson, who's, of course, a well-renowned writer, the greatest poem, whether of ancient or modern literature, is the book of Job. And then Daniel Webster, the book of Job, taken as a mere work of literary genius, is one of the most wonderful productions of any age or of any language. Now, you'd naturally expect that to be the case, since the source of the book is the God of heaven. And so, rightfully, here are people who recognize the value of the book in addition to it being an inspired document. What is it about this book that makes people sing its praises? Most Christians I know don't feel that way about the book of Job. Now, he's making an observation here. Reckon why it could be true. I mean, I don't think he's lying here. But reckon why it could be true that many members of the body of Christ do not hold Job in as high of estimation as do these secular writers. It's probably the reason why they wouldn't just about any part of the Bible. They're ignorant. They don't know the book. They not study the book. You know, I've told you many times when we moved up to Smith County and we were studying a book on church discipline. Well, then we got done with the book on church discipline, and James Meadows' book, Withdraw Yourselves, that was the name of it. And so I asked brethren, what do you want to study next? And they said, well, let's study the minor prophets. I said, oh, that'd be great. So we started studying the minor prophets, and they thought they were getting away from discipline. Of course, we went right to Jonah, and we found out, whoops, you can't get away from discipline even in the Old Testament or even the minor prophets. And so we studied in the minor prophets. Well, when we started getting through with that, then somebody said, well, what are we doing all this studying in the Old Testament? You know. And I said, well, while we don't live under Old Testament law, we know that the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New, and the New constantly makes reference to the Old as a foundational statement relative to man's responsibility to God. And so that's why, and the fellow that was making this statement really did not have that great respect for the Old Testament. While we live under the last will and testament of Jesus Christ, obviously, then he thought it was sort of like a waste of time to spend much time talking about the Old Testament. Well, of course, he's ignorant of the fact. And then, the amazing thing was, he said he wanted to get away from the Old Testament. And so then I said, well, what would you want to study? He said, well, I think we'll study Hebrews. We ain't studied Hebrews ever that I can remember. Now, think about that. Now, sadly, this old fella, just a few years later, was an elder in the church in Lebanon after he left Rome, where I was preaching. But here he thought that we need to study the book of Hebrews, and that we'd spent too much time studying in the Old Testament. Now, we just got through studying the book of Hebrews, and it's obvious that if you don't know something about the Old Testament, the book of Hebrews is going to be like a foreign language. You've got to understand the workings of the Levitical system and the law of Moses, which is exactly the reason why the book of Hebrews was written, because of the people who were trying to go back to a religion that had been taken out of the way. It was good for God's intended purpose, but that purpose had been fulfilled. But he didn't realize that. He didn't understand that. And so when you start talking about all of the shadows and the types under the old covenant and the fulfillment in the new covenant, well, where's those shadows and types originate? Well, they're in the Old Testament of all things. And did not Paul say in Romans chapter 15 verse 4, for whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So there is much to be derived from the Old Testament, and the person that doesn't have an appreciation for any part of God's Word simply indicates they don't know what that particular book's all about. You know, they just don't know. And of course, ultimately, when you're given sufficient time to do better and you don't, then it's more than just not knowing, it's not wanting to know, which is even worse. See? Oh, I'm ignorant of that. Okay, now we've established that fact. Now what are you going to do about it? Are you going to become more knowledgeable of it? Are you willing to put forth some effort to maybe learn a little bit more about it? You know, I mean, we'd expect that in any other area of life. Then as it relates to God's Word, then maybe the same principles should be applied as well. So that many tend to neglect the Old Testament altogether is obviously the case. Yet Paul wrote what we just quoted just a minute ago. Note the Old Testament was written for our learning. That is, it provides patience and comfort, and such can be a source of hope. It's especially true when you consider the fact that here's Job, who's represented in James chapter 5 as one who instilled the very concept, the very demonstration of what patience is. Have you ever known anybody that needed to be a little bit more patient? Well, I don't know a whole lot of people who are patient enough. I know one personally that's not as patient as he'd like to be, more patient than he used to be for sure. But we have the tendency to not be patient people. We want instant everything. Instant gratification, instant oats, instant popcorn, instant T-bone steaks, you name it. It's got to be as quick as it could possibly be. But patience goes a long way, and we see that throughout this book that we're going to be studying for sure. And there's many reasons why it would be neglected, but we're not going to be guilty of that as we're studying it this quarter. Notice the next little section, the place of Job in the Old Testament. Job is the first of 5 books, commonly referred to as books of poetry. And I've done mention that. They're called that because they're written in poetic style, in contrast to narrative style of most other books. You would not expect, if you got a letter from your girlfriend or your boyfriend, you would not expect it to read like a history book, would you? Probably not. Probably not. And so there's different types of literature that read in different ways. And then, of course, he mentions the wisdom literature, which, of course, characterizes the same thing. And so when you look at the 5 books that we mentioned a few minutes ago, here he demonstrates, at least Chambers does, what these 5 books, in a general way, deal with. Job, how to suffer. Now, notice he didn't say, if you suffer, here. No, everybody's going to, some way or another. But he says it's going to be about how to deal with suffering, how to survive what you have to suffer. And we're going to see that in detail. And then, of course, book of Psalms, how to pray, Proverbs, how to act, Ecclesiastes, how to enjoy, and then Song of Solomon, how to love. Now let's look at Job in particular. Now here's some of the more specific introductory material as to who the author is, at what time was it written, all of those things. And of course, in the final analysis of matters, there are some of these matters of introductory material that ultimately don't matter. I mean, that's just fact. You know, when you start trying to place a date on some of the minor prophets, well, what if you're off by a couple hundred years? Is that going to doom you for eternal punishment? Well, of course not, you know. So some of the material that's impossible for us to nail down black and white and 100% this is the way it is, doesn't in any way, shape, or form take away from the inspiration and the message that's associated with that particular book. Same idea here. Who wrote the book and when? Who knows? I mean, God knows. Jewish tradition attributes the book of Job to Moses. And then there's some other suggestions. Job himself, Elihu, Solomon, Isaiah, Hezekiah, Baruch, Jeremiah, scribe. And then I like this next, this quotation. All that can be said with certainty is that the author was a loyal Hebrew who was not strictly bound by the popular creed that assumed suffering was always the direct result of sin. Now, what does that say? It seems to be indicating that there was a common conception among many people that if you were suffering, it's because you deserved to suffer. It's because you had done something that you needed to suffer. You were being punished for something that you did, and thus all suffering could be attributed to you being a sorry scalawag, even though it is hidden from many of the people that you run around with, as we'll see later on in these friends, so-called, that Job has. Job, of course, well, we'll see that. I won't jump ahead if I'm not careful, so I'll hush. Because the author is unknown, and of course, if we could put a specific author to the book, then we could narrow it down a whole lot as to who or as to when it was written, obviously. We couldn't have it written in the year 500 BC and say it was written by Moses, because he was dead and gone by then, see. So we don't know. Its date has been hotly debated among scholars. Some think it was written before Moses. Others put it at the time of Solomon. Some even have it as late as Babylonian exile. I don't believe that's the case at all. But the uncertainty of the author and date does not nullify the inspiration of the book, because it is confirmed in the New Testament that it is, in fact, a historically accurate account, and references are made by inspired writers in the New Testament that verify the reliability of the Old Testament, or the Old Testament account of Job. Well, I don't hush. I'm going to answer something here that's going to be written, so I'll just be quiet. What about the historicity of the book? Is this a historically accurate rendition of what actually transpired? Can this be tied to something that really did happen? Or is this a myth or a legend? Was this something that was concocted by men's imaginations? Well, if it was, then there's no historical basis for it. And if there's no historical basis for it, then it can't be an inspired book. Even though it's inspired, are we to take the events that are described in it as actually true? Here's several reasons that we should. The style. At the opening and the close of the book certainly conform to other biblical narratives that are historical. And then we've got a comparison to 1 Samuel chapter 1:1 and Luke chapter 1 at verse 5. In the book of Ezekiel, which of course is way up there after the children of Israel had been taken into Babylonian captivity, Job is mentioned along with such notables as Noah and Daniel. Well, were Noah and Daniel real live characters? Well, if you're going to question Job's historical existence, then you're going to have to question Daniel's and Noah's too. Well, that'd be sort of silly to do that. You know, it's sort of like, remember, I think I've told you when Tammy went to Cumberland University in Lebanon, she had a science teacher who was a descendant of William Jennings Bryan, okay, like a great nephew or something like that. Anyhow, he was a science teacher. And so those kids would come in there, and of course at the time she was about 30, I guess, and so she was an old woman. She was even older than the teacher, as a matter of fact. And so those kids would come in there and they'd just be talking about all their exploits over the weekend and all the hedonism they were engaged in doing. And she'd rebuke them, you know. And the teacher would say, "Well, don't be so hard on them, Miss Clayton. You know, they gotta live their lives and all." And she said, "But they're acting contrary to what the Bible teaches." So that led to a discussion of the Bible and its authority. To which this professor made the statement, he said, you know, I believe that Jesus lived, and I believe for the most part the New Testament, but the Old Testament, yeah, I just can't go along with that, you know. And of course she asked him, well, what do you have a problem with the Old Testament? Creation, you know. I mean, and a worldwide flood. And she said, well, if you don't believe the Old Testament, you don't believe the New Testament. Because the two things you mentioned right there, Jesus affirmed the historical veracity of both those events. As Jesus said, did not God in the beginning make them male and female? Who's he talking about? He's talking about Adam and Eve. So if you don't believe the Old Testament, you're calling Jesus false. So you can't say, I believe the New Testament, but I don't believe the Old Testament. Because the very God of heaven who sent his son to die for us testifies to those truthful accounts in the Old Testament, including the worldwide flood, including Jonah being swallowed by a great fish. You name it. Jesus testified to those historical events and certainly to the patience of Job as well. So you just can't go, well, that might sound sort of scholarly for a person to make a statement in front of a bunch of naive kids in college classroom. It's just ignorant. I don't care if he's got a doctorate degree from Harvard. That's just an ignorant statement to make. And I'm glad Tammy called him out on it for sure. And of course, James, in the Right Strawy epistle, identified by Martin Luther, in the book of James, he mentions Job as well for his patience. What is the setting of the book? The historical events appeared to be set in what period? The Patriarchal Period. Now, there's a number of reasons why we say that to be the case. When we're talking about the Patriarchal Period, we're talking about the period of time prior to God giving the law through Moses on Mount Sinai and the book of Exodus. Now, while that encompasses only one book, that is the book of Genesis, then that encompasses how many years? About 2,500. So if you've got 2,500 years in the book of Genesis, well, then why do we not have more information about what all went on back then? Well, could it be that we have, I know it is the case, we've got enough information for God's intention to give us as much as he did give us, and here is an event that obviously happened during that period of time in which the law of Moses is not operative. It is a period of time in which God is still communicating through the heads of families, of which Job is one of those heads, as we'll see later on in this particular study for sure. Somewhere between Noah and Moses. And the reason why, of course, it mentioned here, there's no mention of the law of Moses. Reckon why that is? And we got friends and people we've been studying with that would say, oh yeah, here's Job, and he's observing the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Well, where's he doing that? Don't see that nowhere through the book. Reckon why that is? It's because he's living under the patriarchal law, and the Sabbath law was not given till the law of Moses. Well, so there's an absence of something that should be there, according to those who would contend that Sabbath observance is required today, but it's obviously not. So there's no allusion, there's no reference at all, there's no mention of a flood. There's a position that is held by Job that certainly would place him in the position of living under patriarchal law, because he is the so-called priest of his family. He is the one that's responsible for offering sacrifices for his family, which is, of course, in accordance with patriarchal law. And of course, he's not the only one that we have a record of that taking place during this period of time in Genesis, because Abraham does it too, as recorded in Genesis chapter 12. And so when he says, for these reasons, I place Job somewhere contemporary with Abraham. And keep in mind, if you're living upwards of 900 years, then you're going to be a contemporary with a whole lot of people. I mean, you're going to be around with a whole lot of, I mean, some of them just going to be teenagers in their 200s at the same time that others are getting very old. So that's sort of the setting of the book. Well, what's the purpose of the book? The purpose of the book, it's common to suggest that the purpose of the book is to answer the age-old question, why does God allow the righteous to suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? And of course, one of the issues that is oftentimes thrown in the face of the believer is there is absolutely no way that God can exist because look at all the evil that there is in the world. And they think that's a pretty good argument. The only problem with that is, just think about it for a minute. How do you define evil? Is evil a human construct? Is that something that man just developed over time? Or is there such a thing as real objective evil? And for a person to use the so-called problem of evil as a tool to do away with God, then you've got to try to get them to see that they have come up to a conclusion relative to what evil is based on something. How did they arrive at that conclusion? How do you know that something that's classified as evil is not in reality something that's good? How do you make those determinations? Is it majority rule? Is it just so happened that at this time in the world's history, it's a good thing to give your grandmother a plate of cookies, but who knows, in a few years it may be a good thing to hit her in the head with a hammer. Or there's some things that's tied to the very nature of God and of man that are obviously right, and other things that are obviously and objectively wrong. See? When somebody even makes the statement, evil proves there is no God, make them define what they mean by evil. You see, there's a lot of things today. I mean, we've heard of how evil the Supreme Court is for the last week or two. The most evil thing in the world is not allowing a woman to kill her baby. That's evil. Let me tell you something. How you're defining evil is a whole lot different than the way I define evil. As a matter of fact, it's almost to the extent of what Isaiah refers to in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, woe unto them to call evil good and good evil. That put darkness for light, light for darkness, sweet for bitter, bitter for sweet. You call it the opposite. Is that where we are in our society? Well, in many respects, yeah. And what's so pitiful, even in regards to that, I saw a picture today of this girl and her husband. They were in France, and she was talking about, oh, how wonderful it is over here in France where you're free and the food is wonderful. And she was saying that to imply that her home back here in America, the food isn't no good and you're not free. Now, she just demonstrated how ignorant she was because she lives in California. And you can't abort a child in France after the 15th week. So France is a whole lot more restrictive on abortion than California is, or New York. But you know that. Reckon how many other people don't know that? You know, I made the observation the other night that the only countries in the world who have as barbaric of abortion allowance is the United States, Canada, South Korea, and China. Now, that's a wonderful company to be in, isn't it? North Korea. Did I say South Korea? North Korea. Now, those two communist countries, one that's trying to be like America, trying to beat us to the bottom, I reckon, in Canada. But we are the outlier as it relates to abortion law. heathens know better than to kill their offspring the day before they're born. But for some reason, in this country, people don't know that. It's because we call good evil and evil good. And I never thought we'd see the day where it's reversed, so I'm thankful for it. But we can't let up on the subject at all. I forgot where it was at. Oh, the purpose of the book. Why does God allow the righteous to suffer? This is certainly a question Job raises, but it's worthy to note that he himself never received a direct answer, nor is one given by the author as to answering that question, other than what you have to do is take Satan's challenge. Did God fear God for nothing? We're privileged to know the challenge of Satan and that God allows Job to suffer in answer to that challenge, but Job is never told of this. Therefore, I suggest that the purpose of the book is at the bottom of the page to answer the question, how should the righteous suffer? You know, when it's not a question of whether you do or not, it's a question of how do you bear with it? How do you contend with it? How do you allow yourself to not be taken down by it? You know, all that, remember in 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 12, yea, all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. I mean, that says just flat out, everybody that's seeking and determined to live righteous lives is going to suffer persecution some way, somehow. So it's a given then that we're going to suffer persecution. The real question is, how do we do that? How do we deal with it when we do face it? Do we allow it to knock us down to our knees to the point we give up? Well, we can't do that. Does it cause us to throw up our hands and say, it's just too hard? Well, that's worked on some people, you know. In a world that used to want to just get along, then when we're talking about eternity and we're talking about the consequences of lives that are given to the pursuit of every worldly thing in life, then, and the lowering of standards of spirituality, then if there is no conflict, then we have to sort of step back and look at ourselves and see if we are what we're supposed to be, you know. If everybody, remember, Jesus made the statement to the apostles on one occasion, if you're wanting, and this is paraphrasing, if you're wanting everybody to love you, realize everybody loved the false prophets in the Old Testament too, you know. Woe unto them that speak well of you. If that's all you want is people to speak well of you, then you're probably not going to be standing for much of anything. And the people that are going to be disappointed in you are the people who are, in reality, your very best friends and comrades in what you're supposed to be doing, for sure. How should the righteous suffer? On the top of the next page, real quick, while Job's questions and complaints often come close to charging God with wrong, he never crosses the line and humbly submits to God when told the answers to his questions are beyond his ability to understand. Now just think about, that's a mouthful, but think all that's involved in that. He never charges God rashly, you know. He's wanting to know, why am I facing all this stuff? You know, and after listening to his friends, as we'll see later on, you know, that had to be difficult for him to hear all the charges that were being leveled against him, even to the point that you might think, and I've seen this happen, when you take a person that's innocent of a crime, but yet he's in there and he's under examination by cops for 10 hours. After a few hours, then they don't even know where they're at. They're under such pressure that they begin to question their own minds. And I mean, it's led to many a person confessing to a crime they didn't even do. Now, in some instances, the people were were not as sharp as, as they could, as you'd like for a person to be in such a situation as that. But in other situations, the person was just being honest. But by the time they get done under that intense pressure, you did this, you did this, then they start questioning their own minds to the point where some would admit doing something they didn't do. And some, it took DNA many years later to get them off, amazingly. Somebody says, well, I never do that. Well, put yourself, and we'll see this as we get down here towards the discussion with the friends. If you're on the receiving end of all of this accusation, you obviously have done something terrible, because there's no way you'd be suffering like you are without that. You had to have done something bad. Now, we don't know what it was, but just tell us what it was. Get it out here and confess it. And then maybe you can get out all the suffering you're facing. And here's Job. I ain't done anything. I'm not guilty of any vile sin. I mean, all men sin and fall short of the glory of God, but as far as something that would be a justification for losing my family and everything I've got and my health, I mean, what would you have to do to be deserving of what I'm facing? It'd have to be pretty big, wouldn't it? And that mentality, that still exists today. That mentality. Remember, here's this old fella who was born blind, and the disciples asked Jesus, Lord, did this man sin or did his parents sin that he was born blind? You think about that question. This unborn child somehow sinned before he was born? Can you do that? I didn't know you could do that. But that's one of the options, they said. Or if it wasn't that, then obviously his parents sinned and they were stuck now with a blind little baby. Is that the way it works? Well, somebody says that sounds sort of superstitious. Yeah. It's not true. And of course, that's what the book of Job is going to tell us. But it didn't do away with that thinking, because here, all these many hundreds of years later, by the time of Jesus, people are still thinking that. If something bad happens to you, you're on the receiving end of divine punishment. Now, sometimes the consequences of our sin is punishment enough, for sure. But sometimes we suffer the consequences of somebody else's sin. It wasn't that this blind man had sinned before he was born, nor his parents had sinned that he was born blind, but that the power of God would be manifest on that occasion. I mean, that's the explanation that the Lord himself gave anyhow. So that's what we're going to be seeing throughout this book. Anybody got any comments? Any questions? There are, as I stated, in each little section, there's a few little old questions to fill in, just to make sure that we're staying up to speed and actually getting to a degree what we're trying to and wanting to get out of the book. So by all means, spend a little bit of time and do that. And if you have questions, if something comes up in there that you have a special question about that's not addressed in the material, then by all means, write it down or put a check mark to something that's said in here, and we'll deal with it accordingly. Of course, this is not all the material, for sure. I think altogether there's like 42 pages. So this is about a fourth of it, or a third of it. So, and some of you have some extra blank pages, and I don't know how that happened, but somehow there ended up, for some reason, it decided to skip a page, and then it would copy the next page, but I don't know how that happened, but I did notice that. But you're not without the page, it's just maybe a skipped page over further on down the line. Any comments? Any questions? All right, we're going to stop right there then. Lord willing, we'll pick back up on Sunday morning. somebody made the observation Sunday that